Hey, welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab public lecture series. My name's Kat Cizek, and I'm the artistic director of the co-creation studio at the lab. And it's really my pleasure to introduce the lecture today. Dr. Janine Marchessault is a fellow Canadian, and she's one of Canada's brightest media stars, scholars, and advocates. Time and time again, she is known for using her institutional proximity to build power and projects for the community levels. For example, yesterday, she was nominated for a Yorkton Prize for a beautiful film directed by Lisa Jackson called Lichen. Lichen is an IMAX film. It's part of a collection of 5 films that Janine put together, brought together 5 top contemporary artists to make new work in this amazing technology that was invented in Canada in the 60s. But we're not even here to talk about that. We're here to talk about another great co-creative project of Janine's. It's called Archive, Counterarchive, Activating Canada's Moving Image Heritage. And it's a research creation partnership led by Janine, involving over 20 archival organizations and cultural repositories for AV and other media in Canada. I'll let her talk about the project, but I will tell you a little bit about Janine. She's a professor of cinema and media arts at York University here in Toronto, where I'm coming from today. And she was the Canada Research Chair at in Art, Digital Media and Globalization from 2003 to 2013. Dr. Marchessault is the author of 10 monographs and edited volumes and over 50 articles in books and journals and catalogs. She's the principal investigator of the Archive Counterarchive. And here she is. Welcome, Janine.
Thank you so much. I did not know about Lisa Jackson's nomination, and thank you for bringing up the IMAX project. I still want to do a world tour of those films, which is going to happen when the world opens up again. But for now, we're on Zoom. So thank you so much, Kat, for inviting me to be part of this incredible lecture series. Thank you also, Claudia Romano, for organizing the details. So I guess we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So I'd like to start by recognizing the land that I'm on and the location where I am. I'm in Mount Forest. You can see that at the bottom of the map, which is part of the Saugeen Ojibwe territory, made up of 2 nations, Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Miwok Unceded Territory First Nation. I'm on Treaty 45.5 territory signed in 1836, which surrendered 1.5 million of 2 million acres of land to representatives of the Crown. The treaty, along with Treaty 72, has been under dispute for the past 25 years. A landmark claims dispute by both nations of the Saugeen Nation territory to reclaim ownership of land in the Saugeen Peninsula, as well as land underwater, is currently being heard in the courts. A settlement was reached with Grey County very recently, one of 5 municipalities involved in the lawsuit, which resulted in the transfer of approximately 275 acres of county forest, which is not a lot, but it's a start. I'm grateful to the Indigenous people here and across Turtle Island for their hospitality, and I'm committed to working towards decolonial justice with them. So Archive Counterarchive is a research creation partnership involving over 20 archival organizations and cultural repositories for AV and other media across Canada. The project focuses on the challenges but also the generative opportunities afforded by diverse media belonging to Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Black communities, people of color, women, LGBTQ+, and immigrant communities. Our creative methodologies are artists, residencies, case studies, creative counter archives, and public exhibitions. So we're now in year 3. It's a 7-year project. And we were unfortunately just on the verge of starting with a number of exhibitions. So I'm still hopeful, but we're a little bit behind. But what we want to do with this project is call attention to archival media and histories most vulnerable to disappearance and accessibility. And we also want to present new ways of using and thinking about archives. So my talk is divided into 2 parts. In part 1, I'll talk about Counterarchives and some of the projects that have inspired this archive Counterarchive project. And in the second half, I'm going to focus on 2 artists in residence at Library and Archives Canada, Jennifer Dysart and Nadine Valsin. All right, and this is just from our website, some of our case studies. Our website has information on the 8 case studies. It's counterarchives.ca, pretty easy if you want more information on some of the things that are going on. So what are the new theoretical and methodological and political questions that arise from the changing nature of archives as keepers of memory and collective history? And here I'm taking up Rick Prellinger's important distinction between archives as places and stuff and archives as a theoretical construct. So I'm talking about archives as place and filled with things. So archive counter-archive approaches archives in a manner inspired by Michel Foucault, for whom the archive is not a totalizing account of a culture, but, quote, an underlying structure governing thought systems and values of any given society in relationship to its own people and others, end of quote. This structure is what allows for the appearance of certain things and the absence of others. Thus, archives have invariably been shaped by ideological and political narratives about a nation's history in Canada as a white European settler colony. Theorizations of the archive that come from feminist, queer, and BIPOC scholars have provoked a reconsideration of the authority given the archive and what it contains. To help us consider the emergence of counter-archives, which are often linked to community archives emerging as part of the countercultural movements of the 1970s. And that's really where you see these community archives being set up as sometimes as a counter-archive against major archives, sometimes just as the necessity of preserving certain histories that otherwise would not be preserved by the larger institutions. In describing the counter-archive, critical art scholar Simon Osthoff has pointed out that the archive is both a contested site and a medium, and in some cases, it becomes an artwork. We should not see counter-archives, though, as simply oppositional. Brett Kashmir sees the counter-archive as generative, growing out of the digital age. And he wrote about counter-archives in a special issue of the journal Insight in 2010, devoted to counter-archives. The archival turn of the 1990s is marked by the rise of ephemeral counter-archival practices that bring a heterogeneity of media and materials into archives along with performance tactics. LGBTQ+ and feminist communities archives emerge from collaborative processes that mirror the network and nonprofit mode of collective feminist organizing and non-institutional performative approaches to safekeeping history, because archival institutions have historically overlooked their value, as Kate McKinney has argued in her wonderful new book, Information Activism, A Queer History of Lesbian Media Technologies. And Kate McKinney, I'm so excited to say, who's at SFU now, Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, has joined the Archive Counterarchive project, working at Video In, Video Out on an archival project. McKinney situates feminist archives as erotic. She writes, quote, information activism is motivated by desires for shared history and an erotics of being in proximity to a past organized by sexuality, a history built and occupied by others. And here we're seeing a GIF by Kate McKinney and Hazel Mayer, which was based on an installation and performance that they did at the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, now called Archives with a Q. But their whole installation was actually excavating the lesbian porn in those archives. McKinney connects her research into the history of feminist lesbian information network from the 1970s onward to what Audre Lorde describes as an erotics that emerges, quote, from vulnerable connection with others across difference, end of quote. This sharing is the foundation for effective communities. McKinney finds a plurality of media in the information networks and shared infrastructures of feminist lesbian communities in that transition in the 70s and 80s from paper to database networks. So she doesn't find a linear progression, but rather she finds the digital in the different methodologies, index cards and different kinds of paperworks that were being developed to support new information databases and networks. These are tied, she says, to world-making gestures constructed by specific media interfaces and technologies. These circuits create communities and counterpublics which are not monolithic, but constantly open to differences and open to consciousness raising. Another approach to counter-archives comes to us from Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, Dylan Robinson, who has explained how Indigenous archives require counter-archival approaches that use the tools of research creation to produce 21st century Indigenous approaches to archives. And Dylan is also very important collaborator, co-investigator on archive, counter-archive. So he writes, to value the life and agency of Indigenous material culture, whether regalia or artwork, whether public art or private song, is to similarly ask that we consider the conditions of life that might unwittingly perpetuate keeping our culture on life support. Robinson has explored these ideas in a wonderful exhibition co-curated with Candace Hopkins called Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, which was at the Agnes Etherton in 2019 in Kingston, Ontario, which featured newly commissioned scores and sounds for decolonization by over a dozen artists who were asked the question by the curators, how can a score be a call and a tool for decolonization? The scores unfolded over a period of months from January to April, taking the form of videos, objects, graphic notation, museological objects, and written instructions. And so the scores themselves were interpreted by musicians, by dancers, performers, members of the public, gradually filling the gallery and public spaces in the area with a diversity of actions. So you were seeing, and you're seeing here, Tanya Willard's Surrounding. Her score contains the elements of her everyday life. You can see the score, which is appended to the wall, which contains breath, ghost notes, a wood pile, fire burning, chainsaws, and more, all called from her everyday life, interpreted by different artists throughout the time of the exhibition. If you go online, you'll see different interpretations of her score from different communities and musical traditions. So the exhibition is currently on tour. Some performances are online, as I've said, and so hopefully you'll see it at a city near you in the near future. So it's a really incredible exhibition. One of the things that Robinson underlines in his book, Hungry Listening, is the act of refusal. He writes, this is a central tenet of Indigenous studies. He cites the influence of thinkers such as Audra Simpson, David Garneau, Leanne Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, for whom refusal means affirming Indigenous temporalities, withholding information, highlighting Indigenous perspectives, and demarcating Indigenous sovereignty on the page. For Audra Simpson, it does not mean dismantling the master's house, but it means building our own houses. So this brings me to Counterarchives' commitment to a diversity of archival practices, counter-archival formations, and communities who define archives and use archives in different ways. To work across communities to create solidarities and alliances in the name of social justice, and to learn more about what archives can mean through the work of artists. So that is really the mandate of Archive Counter-Archive. The 21st century discourse on archives, especially in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, is marked by a radical shift in thinking about the place of the archive as new post-custodial models are developing, and the critical importance of archives are becoming increasingly important. Laura Miller, historian, who's been thinking about archives in her research over the past decade, has pointed out that the total archives approach is no longer useful. And the total archives approach is not specific to Canada. You find it throughout the world, but it's been hugely, hugely important to the establishment of all of the Canadian archival organizations, especially the major and government archives. And it's an approach, a methodology that was sanctioned by the Massey Commission to collect a diversity of different kinds of materials all together in an archive, whether it's maps, letters, records, or media. So that's the total archives approach. The problem with that approach is it's way too general. Communities define archives differently. They use and they define access differently, copyright, care, and preservation of material history differently, and the diverse and complex protocols surrounding their existence for those communities has to be part of the decolonial processes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, dealing with the irreparable and devastating damages done to Indigenous communities by the residential school system, calls for library and archives and cultural memory institutions to implement its 91 calls to action, suggesting precisely the need to decolonize the archive, the implementation of Indigenous methodologies, and the notion that intangible heritage and other archives belonging to Indigenous communities need to be repatriated to those communities or made accessible at the very least. And we'll see this problem in the work that Jennifer Dysart has been carrying out for almost a decade. So major crossroads are at, major archives are at a crossroads. They are in a process of transforming through partnerships with community archives as new archival models are emerging to expand the authority of archives, the narratives that an archive will tell and metadata that archives carry. They're opening up to deal with, among other things, the problematic of things worn digital, new practices of crowdsourcing descriptions, the importance of translation, especially around Indigenous archives and repatriation. We at the, when I first started working on Archive, Counterarchive, which was around 2016, I approached many archival organizations to host artists in residence and was turned down at every turn. And there's really been a shift in thinking about the role that artists may play in bringing out certain aspects and helping to decolonize the archives. So now I'm going to move into the second part of my talk, which is to engage with two of the artist projects that Archive Counterarchive has been developing. Jennifer Dysart and Nadine Belsin are the two inaugural artists in residence at LAC, Library and Archives Canada. You know, LAC has been very open to working with us, and they worked with a number of archivists there to develop their projects. So the projects are really, you'll feel the contours of them, but they're really very much in process. But I thought it'd be interesting for you to hear about the directions that they're going in. I'll start with Nadine. Nadine went into Library and Archives looking for Black stories. And what she found was that all of the Black stories were associated with crises or with incidences of violence. And she really felt that this was not what the archival elements that she wanted to deal with. And she had made a film called Whitewash on the history of Black slavery in Canada. And so she was used to doing archival work. And what she says, and I'm going to play an interview that I conducted with her a couple of months ago, is that she thought to develop this project, she thought that what she had to do was to do archival research in kind of unusual places, forgotten places, or just to look for them where you wouldn't expect to look for them. So I'm going to share this interview with you. There's a longer version online, but I pulled out the things that I think are the most relevant to this talk.
I came across CBC in the 1960s, had aired Claude Jutras' film À tout prendre. And I'd forgotten that it's basically the story, the love story of Jutras with this woman, Joanna Hell. And in that way, like, the film is very much an archive of the period, because it was shot between 1961 and 1963, and of a Quebec that's going into modernity, and it really references the French New Wave in ways that, you know, replaces the kind of traditional rural kind of film we'd seen out of Quebec. But it's also, interestingly enough, it's an archive of their relationship. And one of the things that I did before I watched the film was I Googled Joanna Hell, because I wondered, like, what became of her. She was born in 1930, and she was the daughter of an African-American father from Texas, whose last name was Harrell, and a Quebecois mother. And when she was 3 years of age, her father died, and her mother fell gravely ill. So she was put in the orphanage. And she grew up in the orphanage, you know, until she was like 18. And when she came out, people did not believe that this Black woman who spoke French was actually Quebecois. Like, they couldn't wrap their heads around it. And basically the nuns told her that she should just say that she's from Haiti, right? So she read up on Haiti, and I guess she learned Haitian Creole, and she kind of pulled this persona off. And then she became the first Black model in North America. She did a bit of acting. She had this love affair with Jutras that became, you know, years later, the subject of the film. And, you know, after that, she moved to France, and she was married to Edgar Morin. There are some really interesting excerpts in the film. One of which is we're first introduced to her when Jutras goes to this party, and the hostess announces that Joanne is going to sing this song in Creole, which is really, it's a Caribbean song, and people might know it as Yellow Bird, that Harry Belafonte used to sing, but it was based on a Haitian poem. So the origins of the song are Haitian, and she sings this song in a very natural Creole, and, you know, Jutras kind of is mesmerized by this kind of exotic presence, and then, you know, they get entangled. And then later on in the film, she admits to Jutras that she's not Haitian, you know, that she was adopted, and, you know, the whole history behind that story.
Je connais que l'été, j'étais élevée dès le bas âge dans un orphelinat. J'étais à la crèche, j'étais à l'orphelinat. Comme je suis brune.
So I want to kind of contrast those two excerpts as being like this performative kind of Blackness identity, and the denial of it, or the revelation.
This is such a rich project that Nadine is working with. She also met up with someone named André Gervais, who has just written a book on Joanna Hell. So she's working with Gervais. What's so fascinating is the co-creation going on in this film. It's really a distinctive characteristic of Jutras' ficto documentary form that he was innovating in the 60s. And so Nadine wants to set up an installation for this project that'll be a 2-screen installation, thinking about W.E. Du Bois' notion of double consciousness, and Fanon's black skin, white mass, and this idea of seeing yourself through another's eyes. But, you know, what's fascinating is she also has correspondence with Jutras and Hell about her self-presentation. There was no script in this film, so all of it is very much improvised. But the other thing that's happened, for those of you that are not following things in Quebec cinema culture, is that Jutra, who was the beloved founding father of Quebec cinema, and has dozens of places throughout the city of Montreal, streets, cinemas named after him, prizes named after him, was essentially outed after his death in the mid-90s by an explosive biography that accused him of pedophilia. And he was stripped so quickly of everything and basically erased from Quebec history. So there's a fascinating tension that this project is going to be dealing with, which is the visibility of Joanna Hell and how she worked to create this persona and to be visible and to become part of history. And then Jutra, who everybody is trying to erase. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of just the richness of the project. We may end up having a virtual exhibition next fall, just to bring different elements together. Okay, so I want to move on to talk about Jennifer Dysart's work on the project. I met Jennifer when she was an MFA student at York University, and she was developing a project. This is her thesis film, Return After the Flood. And it's a film that went on to win lots of awards. So the film is about a land dispute between Manitoba Hydro and the Cree people of South Indian Lake in 1968. Manitoba Hydro initiated a massive environmental disruption that forever eroded the community's traditional way of life because their lands were flooded and their community was decimated. So Jennifer has roots in this community. This is where her father is from. The CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, created a documentary about the Hydro project and filmed the meeting of the community with the Manitoba government. This is incredible footage for her. The people at this town hall are her relatives and the relatives of various members in the community. So it's a very, very precious material that she has brought in to her film that she wanted to get permission to use. And when she approached the CBC to use the footage, she was told that they would have to charge her $160 a second for access to this material. So this has really been just this very issue, gaining access to images of the Cree community in Northern Canada has been Jennifer's project. It's also tied to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. CBC is a public broadcaster. We pay for those programs, as is the NFB, but we've had better luck with the National Film Board of Canada. So I just want to show you a clip from the town hall so you can get a sense of that material.
So if the flood does come, if I have to move, he says, I'll move to where all the rest of the people will be going. He says, but I want Hydro to build me a house, give me a stove and some plates. Because he says, my livelihood will be spoiled completely. I used to have 3 full meals a day. What is her name? Mrs. Stephen Moose.
Yes, Mrs. Moose.
I used to like staying at South Indian Lake. But now he says I don't like it at the very present time. He says I had 3 full meals a day.
I wouldn't mind compensation if I had nothing else to live on, but I'm one guy that I like to make my own living. Like, I don't want nobody else to make it for me. Like, I don't want to live on relief, because that's not very good. I don't think any man likes to live on straight relief. And set some nets and I can catch maybe 100 fish to it right now. Because I know where it is, because I fished there it's about 10 years ago. I've been fishing the same place damn near every year. But if there's another 35 feet of water on top of that, well, then the fish will move away, then I won't know where to go. Because, I'll be scared to set nets because I'll lose my nets if I set on top of a bunch of trees.
I feel if there's anything that Counterarchive accomplishes, it's getting the CBC to actually give access to some of those materials. So for her project with Library and Archives Canada, Jennifer found a film that was shot in the area known as Keewatin. So this is, again, South Lake, Indian South Lake in Manitoba. And so you can see it there. The film she found was shot in the early 50s, and she believes that it was shot by an industrialist, not the priests that were in the area at the time working with the industrialists, but an industrialist known as Falconer McLean and or Joseph McNally. So they don't really have the provenance of this film, but the footage makes clear that there was a real intersection, a collaboration between industry and religion in the dispossession of Indigenous people from their land. So these are some of the images that she found. It's a very derogatory film, as much as it's documenting everyday life in the community. There are subtitles throughout that are negative and really disrespectful of the Indigenous people that are pictured. So what Jennifer wants to do is make new subtitles, but also bring this footage back to her community. So she calls this a kind of phase 2, which is to identify the people in the pictures, because the communities are still there and they will be able to identify the different people. So it's sort of, for her, she's going to pull out through the images the resilience of that community that you can see depicted. So as I said, both the Artists in Residence projects are really unfinished, but we're thinking probably of an online exhibition, and there'll also be films as well. I want to, by way of a conclusion, turn to another film that Jennifer made, still in the same vein of finding film and video tied to the Cree community in northern Manitoba. This was for a project called Homemade Visible, which is really a milestone project in the history of community-based media projects. And Homemade Visible was a brainchild of Ananya Ori, who was the festival director of the Regent Park Film Festival in Toronto. The Home Made Visible ran from 2017 to 2019. And it was basically an archival drive to collect and screen home movies by BIPOC communities, largely absent from Canada's memory institution. The project collected over 280 home movies, or not collected, digitized for free, and then collected 40 of those movies into an archive that is being cared for at York University at the Clara Thomas Archives, and is publicly accessible. And you can see Nadine Valsin's family is there, and Nadine participated, gave over some of the home movies. The project also invited 8 BIPOC artists, many of whom contributed work to engage and activate and remediate home movie footage. So Jennifer's project was a project called Caribou in the Archive, and it builds upon a degraded, very fragile VHS tape of Violet Woods, who is an elder in the Cree community in South Indian Lake. And it's a VHS that her brother gave to her, and the VHS that Violet is his mother. So it's a very, very precious tape, and it's of a caribou hunt. It's her first caribou hunt. So these are very precious also because there aren't that many images of Cree women hunting. So as I was saying, Violet has since passed away, so it's even more precious. But what you're going to see in this final clip is the whole process of transferring the VHS video and basically saving that material. And Jennifer did that work at York University. At the VHS, she could hear the sound, but she couldn't see the image. She was going from edit suite to edit suite. And finally, she put her body on the VHS machine. And at the same time, there was an electrical storm outside. And she feels that she transferred her body. She was a conduit for that transference of images. So it's a very dramatic moment.
Getting ready for the caribou hunting. You getting the fire going, Violet?
No, I dropped my lighter in the snow.
How's the hunting? How's the hunting?
Good. There's more open.
Did you get one?
Yeah. There's lots more over there.
Is that right? Oh, that's a nice looking animal, boy. Yeah, it's gonna go. We'll have the tea on pretty soon.
Okay, let's go take a picture. I don't think it's... Irish what we're seeing over there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, will you?
Yeah. But they're pretty scared. Is that your first caribou?
Will you need it?
Yeah, it is.
I'll come and fix it.
I'll light the fire and you clean that caribou.
I don't think so. I'll make the fire.
Okay.
Okay, great. I think I'll end with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janine. Transference. It feels like the entire archive, counter-archive project is one big act of transference and throwing ourselves onto the VHS machine. And we're just so thrilled to have you here, Janine, for all this work, and in particular because so many of the fellows in the Open Documentary Lab community are involved in counter-archive projects. I'm thinking Asia, you, so many here that are just popping onto screen now. And I welcome questions from the lab community, and also others. If you have questions in the Q&A, we'll hope to get to them. But anybody from the lab, or any questions or comments for this presentation for Janine? Oh, Asia.
Thank you so much for that, Janine. That was really fascinating. I was furiously taking notes at some of these resources you listed. I'm curious about, this question of the bureaucracy around the archive. Like when you mentioned this whole, the exorbitant licensing fees, for that footage, for example. How does the counter-archive push back against that? In terms of access, creating bureaucratic access, or disrupting ownership and ideas about ownership and who can lease and who owns that footage and who houses it. It's kind of a larger conversation people are having about museums in general, but can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, that Jennifer is the perfect person because she's a case study, but Nadine as well has had trouble. I'm not quite sure how we're gonna access the footage that she needs to access. So we really do want to go to at least the CBC and just start with a very simple case like Nadine's case, and also quote the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which most governments have supported and approve of. And we had a workshop with a former CBC and NFB, National Film Board, producer, and she saying that she thought part of the problem is that nobody knows who owns the copyright. It's too complicated. So just easy to say, okay, it's $160 a second, so that they cover themselves. And so we have to actually start to have those difficult conversations. And we also have lawyers who are part of Archive, Counter-Archive, who are gonna help us. So we're actually planning to have a conference probably in about a year. I hope it's not online, but it may well be, around television in particular. The National Film Board has been really progressive around these issues. And Jennifer, in the clip that you just saw, has numerous excerpts from National Film Board films, and they have given over, free of cost access and use of that. But the CBC is very, very difficult, and there are other archives that are stuck in that. So I think it's a process, and it's educating people, but also I'm also hoping that we get the media involved and sort of tell that story through the media, because most people, the general public, would not agree that artists should be charged that amount of money, since they make no money off of it, But Jennifer, with that first film, cannot show that. She shows it at festivals, but it can't be shown on television, that can't be broadcast. So it is a problem.
They should be paying her to make the films.
Right?
Artemis.
Hi, I love your project, and I know we don't have much time, so I just wanted to quickly say, in my teaching, I've taught Nanook of the North alongside this film made by Claude Masseau, Revisiting, Nanook Revisited, where they go in the helicopter and they go down and they show everyone the film, and it pulls out all of the kind of, crazy, inaccurate and derogatory and atemporal kind of approaches of the original film, but also, the shows it to kind of like the community now, and they actually laugh at a lot of things, and they kind of they watch it annually. And so I think it has kind of like latent counter-archival potential, the Masseau film. And I'm wondering if you can think of other kind of, Canadian projects prior to your project that might also have this latent potential that could be teased out by your project.
Yeah, I can't think of one off the top of my head, although there's a lot of artists, and dealing with archives and turning archives on their head. But
or rather, perhaps does your project help us to see these earlier films as projects as being part of a kind of a counter-archival tradition, even, before avant la lettre? I hate that expression, but
yeah. And what the other thing we are hoping to do is bring archives into classrooms. And we have a pilot project with the Toronto School Board, the TDSB, Toronto District School Board, for grade 10 to 12. And so some of the projects we feel are going to be really useful and appropriate for schools. And I think it's about looking at archives and looking at old film footage that may be silent, may not look that good, but kind of passing on that passion and that fascination for those images. I just love the Jennifer Dysart story of the VHS, because it's like, oh, I can see an image, which is incredible. But yeah, I think there's a shift in how we see archives and the use of archives, and activating them, bringing them into learning institutions, seeing new things with them, and then yes, bringing them into different community situations where they take on new meaning. Because Jennifer's project is a real process-oriented project, because as people identify different people, there's more stories and more archives. It's kind of like linked data, right? It just will continue to grow. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question in the group, if there's anybody. William.
Sure. So first of all, Janine, thank you so much. It's wonderful. Just the notion of the living archive. There's a bunch of related terms, living archive, in terms of kind of keeping these as generative sites as opposed to dusty reference points in time. So anyway, what you showed us was really terrific. And I guess I want to ask a question that goes back to your framing of the discussion when you talked about tried to distinguish the total archive approach from a more culturally sensitive and culturally specific approach to archives, which can wind up, which acknowledges the ownership, people's ownership of their images and their culture and heritage, but in that acknowledgement risks even further exclusion from the kind of halls of power. That precisely by not being total, they're not part of the story, and that kind of elision from culture is sustained. It's sustained as a self-proclaimed absence in a certain way, but the implications down the road, and I'll just make it concrete. I did a lot of work in New York City archives, turn of the century, on immigrant communities and their encounter with cinema as a new medium, or their encounter, what was their embrace of popular culture. And some cultures are really well represented, and some cultures are absent. And the absent cultures are absent because they decided to hold their own archives. They didn't want them to be part of a city they weren't welcome in the city, frankly, but they didn't. The other group pushed hard, got their stuff in the city, so that for researchers like me today, going back, one story is told. If you're really creative, you can find that story. The other story is impossible to find. Yeah. And it made sense at the time, but 100 or so years later, it's a real gap in the record, and the story will not be told, and the story is not remembered. So I guess that's the dilemma. And I guess I want to understand better this more local approach to thinking about archives.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. It's a really fascinating problem. So I think that there are new approaches now, because, you know, the question is whether those communities that chose to maintain a community archive would in fact have been that well represented. I know in terms of the history of the city of Toronto, for example, we've been looking at turn of the century, looking for turn of the century photographs, and you know, Italian communities or certain communities, European white, are represented. Other communities are not. So I think it's a difficult story. But one of the, if you want to call it a solution, is connecting those archives. You know, in the US, the archives are in much better shape than they are in Canada. And part of the problem is total archives, is that a lot of our archivists don't have the training to take care of a diversity of different kinds of materials, so don't collect them. But just back to the importance of connecting smaller archives with the larger archives. I think that's a new it's a new trend, at least in Canada, but I think you see it in the US too, is actually sharing resources, and then as things come online, right, actually connecting the different pieces and the different stories. But yeah, it's a problem.
Thank you, Janine, and thank you so much. There's a lot of love for your presentation in the chat, a lot of great responses. Somebody's wondering how to keep in touch with the developments, in particular the conference. How can people learn more about what's going to come up?
Yeah, just the website, Counterarchives. We have a lot of activities going on. We have a summer school with 2 workshops, one on Indigenous methodologies and metadata, and the other one on AIDS activist videos of the 80s and 90s. So I just did a plug there. But yeah, just the website. We have a news section. It's just ongoing. It looks very messy, but I think it's good. It's busy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Janine, for joining us. We're going to watch with great admiration, and look forward to more from you and the whole team. Thank you so much, and we'll see all of you next week at the MIT Open Documentary Lab Public Lecture Series. Thank you.